maybe we can talk about that term justification, and that can raise a couple of issues. You've already mentioned apocalyptic and eschatological. We can talk about that in a minute, but maybe we could start with what do we mean by justification, especially in conversation with the new perspective on Paul, whoever you want to put in that category, and that's related to the works of the law. Why don't we start with the definition of justification? What is that about? And there's a lot of confusion. Maybe students who come across this or pastors, maybe they're hearing a lot of static. What is the best way to understand justification?
Yes. Yes, I would argue, along with the reformers, but I think it's lexically established, that justification is declarative and forensic. So what justification means, God is the judge, and God as the judge declares those who put their faith in Jesus Christ to be in the right as the judge. So I would distinguish this from those who say he makes us righteous, right? That's a traditional Catholic view. We're not made righteous, we're declared to be in the right. I think it's a legal and forensic term, uh, based on Christ's death and resurrection. And then I would add theologically, the righteousness of Christ is imputed to us. It's counted or credited to us. Now, so, the most famous new perspectivist, at least in evangelical circles, is N.T. Wright. And N.T. Wright, Brandon, you know this, he's hard to read because he says a lot of different things in different places. So he will say that justification is forensic and declarative. Um, but he also argues that justification is fundamentally ecclesiological instead of fundamentally soteriological, which, so to put it in more popular terms, justification is fundamentally about who's a church member, about church membership instead of about salvation. And I would argue, actually, I think that's backwards. I think, when we look now in my mind, and I respect Tom, and Tom is brilliant, but I actually don't think this is very difficult. I think when we actually look at the text, when Paul's talking about justification, he's talking about our relationship with God, not fundamentally our relationship with people, with fellow church members. Obviously, it has implications for church membership, but it's not fundamentally about that. So that's one place I disagree with Tom. And the other place is he denies the imputation of Christ's righteousness. Now, I would say, Galatians isn't as clear. I think we have to look at all of Paul. Galatians doesn't as clearly teach us that. I think that there's a theological and exegetical construct there. I think it's clearly there in the text. But Tom denies it. And why is that important? Because Tom also argues that the works we do as Christians, are at least part of the basis of our right standing with God on the last day. So if you deny the imputation of Christ's righteousness, and then you put in the idea that our works are the basis, at least partially, of our right standing with God, I think that is quite defective.
And that would be more of a transformational view of justification that you were talking about earlier, where we're made righteous, and our righteousness becomes part of
Well,
this.
of course, Tom doesn't say that, Tom, but clearly the apocalyptic, we talked about the apocalyptic school. The apocalyptic school definitely says that, right? That justification means we're made to be in the right. But yeah, that's where Tom's quite difficult to unravel because he'll say, well, no, justification is forensic, but then he has this other idea and he's quite hard to put together, right? And I've been in debates with him, which have been friendly, but it's hard to debate him because if you say something, he'll say, well, no, I said this somewhere else. And actually he did.
What,
He's a
what do we
little
talk about? Yeah, go ahead.
he's a little bit hard to track down sometimes.
You mentioned the apocalyptic. This can be a different category for people to understand. What is the apocalyptic Paul, and how does that relate to Galatians? and to justification. And how do you relate that to another option that you cover in the book, eschatological, and then the way you bring those together? So maybe you can just give a brief overview for what those mean and how they may or may not relate to the teaching of Galatians.
Yeah, yeah. I think another way of putting it, eschatology, which has to do with the fulfillment of God's promises. I think there's a salvation historical dimension to eschatology. All the promises we find in the Old Testament are fulfilled in Christ. And the apocalyptic school emphasizes the radical intervention of God in Jesus Christ. And I don't spend a lot of time on this in the book, but I want to argue, and here actually I agree with Tom Wright. The salvation history, eschatology, and apocalyptic, they're not enemies, but they're friends. It's both. We have the fulfillment of God's promises in Galatians. We have the fulfillment of the covenant. Well, I think it starts with Genesis 3:15 and the covenant made with Abraham, and then the covenant with David, and the new covenant. We have the fulfillment of those covenant promises. But it happens in a striking, climactic, surprising, divine apocalyptic intervention. So I don't think we have to choose between those two. And, the apocalyptic school tends to say, well, if you believe in eschatology and salvation history, you believe in this smooth arc of history and it's all very predictable. But I think even reading, we do have the fulfillment of the story, but there's ups and downs in the story. There's back and forth. It's a jagged line, and it's not always smooth. So we don't have to deny there's a fulfillment of the promises and there's a fulfillment of a story, but at the same time, it happens in an apocalyptic, shocking way, which is one reason I believe that the religious leaders rejected Jesus, because the way the fulfillment happened was shocking to them. And I think it was shocking to Paul. And I want to say that I think it's very significant in Galatians that in the first 5 verses, right, the greeting, one of the longer greetings in Paul's letters, if you compare all 13, I take all 13 letters as authentic. It's very striking. It's the only greeting he mentions the resurrection, and he mentions in the greeting he gave himself for us to deliver us from the present evil age. And I would argue you have both things there. The resurrection is an apocalyptic act of God, but it's also eschatological. It's the fulfillment of God's promises. It's the indication that the new age has arrived, and so too the death of Christ. The death of Christ delivers us from the present evil age. I think that is both apocalyptic and eschatological. And I would say there's a sense in which that's the whole letter. If you understand what he says in the first 5 verses, of course circumcision is no longer required because the old age is over. Because the resurrection's come. Once the resurrection has come, Ezekiel 37, Isaiah 25 and 26, Daniel 12, the new age has come. God has radically intervened in history now in the resurrection of Christ.